3, 2.
Hello everyone. Sorry for the delay. We had some technical glitches today. And welcome to our third session. And today we have got Ahmed with us, who is going to talk on app services. So previously, I think most of the ones who are developers here have heard about containers or working on containers. So Ahmed is going to show us how you can actually keep all the Kubernetes bits and pieces outside and still use containers and deploy it on app services. But before we start, I'm going to start off with a quick quiz today, which Philip from our side was not able to answer. So I'll just do a first I'll do a quick round of introduction from Microsoft side. Yeah. So from Microsoft side, we have got Philip again, we have got Amanda and Rebecca. We'll be answering all your questions alongside the presentations. So feel free to shoot out all your questions and answers throughout the session. Don't leave it for the end of the session because we want to make it more interactive. Now coming back to Philip, so he was not able to answer one of the questions that I asked him, so I'm going to ask it out to the crowd. And also Ahmed, Rebecca, or Amanda, anyone can answer that question. So here it goes. What is the object-oriented way of becoming rich? So whoever answers that question gets a swag from Philip because he was not able to answer.
And in my defense, I thought Shri was making a terrible joke. So I'm just going to put that out there as well. So Ahmed, do you have the answer to this one? You'll love it. It's so corny. It's fantastic.
I don't know.
Okay, it's a bit cheeky response. It's inheritance.
All the people on this call are muted. We can't hear them. They're muted, right? But I can hear the collective groan.
There's someone actually replied. Inheritance.
Love it. Thanks.
Awesome. There you go. Over to you, Ahmed.
Sure. I'm going to put Ahmed on the screen now, guys. So
just a quick thing. We are going to record this session, and the recorded session will be available, but it'll take some time for us to upload it. But we'll keep you posted on that.
Love it. Thanks, Shri. Over to Ahmed.
Awesome. Can you see my screen first before I start?
Yep. I think we can see your screen.
Awesome. So yeah, hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just a very quick intro about myself. My name is Ahmed Al-Sayed. I work for Insight Group as a principal consultant in the apps and infra team. I've been in this industry for 15 years now with a background in app development, in web, mobile, SharePoint, BI solutions, universal apps, almost everything Microsoft thought of. I've been consulting for 5 years now with Insight and other big consultancies. Mainly what I do now and been doing for the last 3 years is to help organizations migrate and optimize their infrastructure in the cloud. As well as specialize in app modernization and helping teams to transform and utilize the cloud, of course, mainly Azure. And yeah, below you can see my Twitter and LinkedIn contact details. So as I mentioned, I work for Insight. It's a company based in 19 countries so far with a workforce of over 11,000 people globally. We have a broad areas of expertise globally. As you can see, I'm part of the cloud and data center transformations piece, but there are lots of other people, as you can imagine, doing other things, covering the end-to-end capabilities. We're mainly specialized in app modernization, DevOps, cloud transformation, data solutions, custom solutions, and many other things. So yeah, I reckon Insight marketing team is happy, so let's move on. So yeah, enough talk about myself and Insight. Now let's talk about the cool stuff we're going to cover today. My aim today is to show you how easy it is to deploy a fresh application into Azure using Azure App Service and deployment slots. The session will be a good long demo, but I'll go very quickly on the slides first to talk about our building components and the concepts before starting the demo. So our app is a React.js app with a .NET Core backend. It's the app that you can create using the .NET template. So if you go to CLI and go .NET Create React, that's the app that I'm going to use. We will containerize the app and use Azure DevOps to deploy it into Azure App Service deployment slots. And then we'll play with deployment slots and show you how you can use it efficiently and show you the cool features that it has. Last thing, and I hope we can find time for this, is to use Application Insight to read metrics and errors from our app. Just a note, don't freak out if you didn't hear about those words before. We'll cover everything in the demo in the slides. So this is just a visualization of the last slide to help you understand what you're going to create. So as you can see here, we have a GitHub repo that has the infrastructure code as well as the application code. And we've got Azure Pipelines, which is the main driver, pulling the code from GitHub, building the app, Dockerizing it, creating a Docker image, and then pushing that image into an ACR, Azure Container Registry. And then Azure Pipeline would push the image from ACR into an app service deployment slot. From the infrastructure side of things, I've used Terraform. So Terraform is going to spin up all the infrastructure we're going to use for our app to work. So we'll just go, some concepts. So Docker container is a very modern and consistent way of bundling your application along with your configuration and dependencies to deploy anywhere and on any machine without having to worry about prerequisites and blaming someone's machine. It's very portable way of deploying your application and makes life of developers, DevOps, infrastructure guys way easier. Azure Container Registry, think of it as a bank of Docker images. So when you create a Docker image, you want to push that image somewhere to host your image. So typically you'd use something like a Docker Registry or Azure Container Registry. So ACR, it's just like a Docker registry, but the cool thing about ACR is that it's fully integrated with role-based access control and Azure Active Directory, since it's part of the Azure Foundation. For the premium SKU as well, you can enable the security scanning of the images using Azure Security Center, which is a great security option for enterprises. Azure App Service, it's similar to what we used to do with IAAC or Apache servers or hosting a web server and a Linux machine. It's the native way of hosting an application in Azure. This app can be a couple of files like a normal web app, like we used to do in the old days, in any language like .NET Core or some other languages, or it can be a Docker container, which is what we're gonna see today. Azure App Services Service plans can also scale up and down and out as well in case you have high loads in your app, and this happens automatically. So that's a really cool feature in Azure App Service, and it has a very cool other feature, which is an optional feature called deployment slots that we're going to talk about today in later slides and in details in the demo. So now we're going to talk about deployment slots, which is the main focus. So suppose that you have a web app deployed in Azure App Service, and it has a URL like production.website.com. That's a normal Azure App Service. Okay. You can very easily add an additional deployment slot that is like a full-fledged app service. And it's like a separate web app. It's like a separate web app for you as a user and a developer. It sits next to your original web app, and your users would only be accessing the original one, which is the production slot. However, you can use the staging website or the other slot to deploy new versions of your web app. And this is like a secondary slot for you. you can test your slot and make sure it works fine, and then you can swap between production and staging. The good thing about those slots is that every slot has got its own URL. So this is like production.website.com, and this is staging.website.com. There's two different web apps for you. So yeah, a really good feature about deployment slots. It's not only mimicking your production service. It's not like just a separate web app, but also you have the ability to swap the slots very easily and with zero downtime. No zero downtime in swapping slots. Also, deployment slots can be very handy when thinking of canary releases and controlling the amount of traffic going to every slot under the production URL. So for example, this user is requesting the site on production.website.com. You can redirect the call to the staging.website.com, like the staging version. In other words, you can redirect a portion of the traffic coming from the user, from the production URL, to test your staging version in staging deployment slot, and detect all the issues and all the bugs that you need to fix before promoting that version to be your new production version. So this is also known by some people as testing in production. So typically companies would say, okay, I want like 2% of the traffic going into the staging website, and then we'll just monitor what's happening with the staging website, how is it performing, any issues, and work on them before promoting that to be the dominating production version. You can also revert back to the older version. So suppose you have a staging website that is broken, like you've figured out that it's broken after you already promoted it to be the production. You can easily click a button and revert it back. So you can bring up the previous production version, and it's like instant with zero downtime and way faster than chasing this through like a release pipeline. Azure Application Insight. It's part of Azure Monitor. It's the native way in Azure for monitoring and reading other metrics from your app. It's used to record metrics like request rates, response times, helps in detecting and diagnosing issues, since you can read logs, exceptions, and other things that might help you in catching bugs. Something to note here is some people might argue that using tools like App Insight is bad for your applications in terms of performance, which is not true really, because tracking calls are not non-blocking calls, and they're batched and sent in a separate thread, so not affecting the main running thread. So yeah, I highly doubt that it affects your performance. So yeah. Last slide. Terraform, which I use to script the infrastructure. It's an open source tool, and yeah, it's free for everyone. It's cross-platform, so you can use it to script any cloud platform service, and it uses a language called HCL, which stands for HashiCorp language, which is extremely easy to read, update, and manage. And also something to note here is that the big 3 cloud providers fully support Terraform and help in developing their own plugins. So you're good to go. You'll even find it in Microsoft documentation. So before we jump into the demo, just a reminder what you want to do. I don't want people to get lost with the previous slides. So again, we've got the GitHub repo with the code both for the infrastructure code and the application code. We've got Azure Pipelines hooked up with GitHub. It pulls the code from GitHub, creates a Docker image, and then pushes the image into the ACR and deploy it into the app service slot. And again, Terraform to create the infrastructure. So now, time for the demo. So before we start, I just want to show you that there is a GitHub repo that I created. That's the URL. So this GitHub repo is available for everyone, so you can play with it after the session. And
yeah, we'll include links as well to all the participants at the end of this, so you guys can jump in.
Awesome, thank you, Philip. And that's the portal, the Azure portal. So I just created a resource group, and as you can see, it's fresh and empty. And that's my pipeline. So let's start first with Visual Studio Code. So I cloned the repo, and as you can see, there is the infrastructure as code folder, which is everything in Terraform here. So for the sake of time, I'll just run Terraform and then talk about what we have in the repo.
Can you zoom it a bit, please, Ahmed?
Can you see now? Is it bigger?
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So it's now creating all the services that I talked about. So service plan, inside, application insight, and container registry. So let's jump back to Visual Studio Code and talk about what we have here. So Terraform, under the infrastructure as code, you'll find that like a file for every service. So ACR, that's the file that creates that's the bit that creates the ACR. That's the app insight, and that's the app service. And as you can see, I created the app service here as well as the staging slot, like another slot. And I'm going to show you how it works when it gets deployed. This is going to take a couple of seconds. Maybe jump back here, refresh, and see the magic happening. So that's the container registry that I was talking about. Maybe you can open it and have a look. And you can see that we have repositories here. And that's the bank of container images that we can use. So when Azure Pipeline runs, it pushes the image, the Docker image, into this ACR repository. So that's the app service. It's almost done. So let's have a look at the URL of the app service. And as expected, it will be empty because we didn't deploy anything yet to the application, to the app service, because we didn't run the CI pipeline yet. Meanwhile, let's run the pipeline as well to deploy the application. So yeah, that's the application. So that's the app service. And as you can see, nothing is deployed in there. So that's why it's empty. And if we go here back to our resource group and refresh, we'll find that there is a staging slot here. So if you go to the app service and go to the deployment slots on the left-hand side, you can see we have two slots, the production one and the staging. So if you go to the staging, you'll notice that it has a different URL. By default, it just adds a hyphen and the name of the slot. So that's the name of the app service, and then hyphen staging, which is the name of the slot. And again, if you open that one, it's going to be, oops, it's got something. Anyway, maybe the pipeline is running. Let's talk about what we have in the application folder. So we covered already the infrastructure as code. Let's talk about the application folder. So if you go to your CLI and go .NET create React and just give it a name, it's going to create this template for you. it's like I didn't change anything in this template. It's what comes out of the box. The only thing, so just to explain a little bit about the application. So you've got the client app folder, which is a Node.js, React.js application. That's the front end. So you'll find all the pages and everything here related to the front end. Other than that, the rest of the files are related to the .NET Core backend and the APIs. So you know, if you open this one, for instance, you'll find some functions and some stuff here. Also, I created the Docker file, which I wrote myself. It wasn't included in the template, but you'll find it in the GitHub repo. You can copy it. So just to explain what it does. So I started with Microsoft's .NET Core image, which is the SDK. And the reason I started with this is I want to first build my application and publish it. So I start with this and then build my app, Node.js for the the React app, and then .NET Restore for my CS project, which is the .NET Core application, and then publish my app and copy everything into the new container. And then here I started again with another slimmer. That's the slim version of that .NET Core image. And that is what is going to be included in the image that is going to run in the app service. So I don't need the complete .NET Core image to run the app service. I just need this one. And then, basically exposing port 80 and copying all the files from the build to the publish folder. Let's go back to build, see what is happening. So that's my build pipeline. As you can see, it's building the image. So just running some Docker commands, and you can see all the steps included in the Docker file that I just talked about. So running all these commands, and then pushing the image. And you can see here, it's pushing the image to this URL, which is the inside demo container registry that I just created and showed you in the Azure portal. And then pushing to staging slot. And that's what is happening now. So deploying the image to the staging slot, it's just adding this property to the application slot. It says Docker, use this image, and this is the tag. Yeah. Hopefully it finishes now. Yep, it's done. So let's jump into the application. So that's the results group. That's the app. So what would you expect from this? So I ran the build pipeline, and this pipeline has pushed the application into my staging slot. So if we go first to the deployments, to the production slot, I would expect that to be empty because it doesn't have anything. I did not push anything to the production slot. Meanwhile, let's open the deployment slot. Staging slot, sorry. Link. And as you can see, that's the, oops, I think it's cached. That's why it's showing this. Yep, it was cached. So that's the app. Like I didn't do any changes in the app. That's the native Create React app that comes out of the box. So this app has got like this page. It's a single page application in React.js, as I mentioned, and it has got this fetch data thing, which goes .NET Core Web API and just displays some random data, but it goes through the Web API. So pay attention to this web app to this page, because we're going to break it in this demo and show you how you can use Application Insight to track what's happening. And that's the production URL, and as expected, it's broken. Now let's go to the let's see the swap functionality now. So deployment slot. I can click swap here and say, okay, I want to swap from staging to production. And Azure is going to show you what are the changes in configuration between those two slots. So basically it's saying that, hey, there's a configuration pointing to some Docker image, and that's in the old value, which means the source, the staging, and it's going to the target. It's going to be the new value for the target. So I can just click swap and see what happens here. So when you click swap, or when you enable swapping, two things happen under the hood. So think of it as, you've got one application service and two slots, but those two slots are actually like two separate web apps. So what happens when you swap them? Two things. Azure App Service first tests that if you swap from staging to production, it's a valid swap. And what I mean by valid swap is the staging slot is functional, is not broken, and it will try to hit the root of that staging slot with some requests and wait for HTTP responses, like any HTTP response, to ensure that it's a working application and it's alive. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Azure App Service swaps also the IP virtual address of the two slots. So the IP address of the production slot becomes the IP address of the staging slot, and the same thing for the staging slot becomes the IP address of the production slot. So it swaps them for you. Also, something to note here is for existing sessions, like if I'm a user and using the production slot and using the website, you don't want that user to feel like all of a sudden the whole application has changed while I'm using this website, right? Like I'm using an active session. You don't want the user to feel like things have changed all of a sudden for an active session. So swapping slots only work for new sessions. So yeah, that really gets handy for when you're deploying new versions. You don't have to care about people using your existing site, because you're not taking the whole thing down like a release pipeline. It's just swapping slots. So the existing users can still use the existing session until they're done, and the new sessions are going to use the new version. Have you got any questions, Philip, until the swap thing finishes?
Amanda might have a question, actually. Amanda, do you want to shoot one through?
Yeah, so we've received a bunch of really great questions in the Q&A section. So one of the questions is that we often find ourselves in a spot during migration where we want to run our apps on Azure as an app service, but we actually need to connect back to on-prem databases running with VMs with domain and Windows authentication. So how do we solve this connectivity without using SQL auth? Some of the makeshift solutions have been things like app service environments, but still looking for some help and best practices around this.
So you're talking about connecting from your Azure App Service into your on-prem database. I'm not going to talk about the infrastructure kind of part of things and the security and all that side of things. I'm just going to talk about the the settings and the app settings for every application. So that's a really good thing actually to talk about. So every deployment slot has got its own application settings. So for example, if you've got production and you've got staging, and you can easily connect the staging to like a staging database and the production slot to connect to the production database. And then when you're swapping the versions, still the new version of the like the new version, which is the staging version, when it gets promoted into the production slot, it will connect to the production database, and you can control that. You know, when you go to every slot, and see, yeah, slots, and can go here, for instance, and go, you know, that's my settings, configuration. Can have your configurations here, like your database connections and everything. They're not going to go away when you do swapping. So now the swapping has finished. Now we are going to refresh the production, and as expected, the production version now has got the old staging version, like the working version. And if we go to the staging version, I need to clear the site data just to make sure like it thinks I'm a new user, a new session. As you can see, it has got now the previous production version, which is an empty version. Now let's go to the application code, and let's do version 2. So let's go to the client app, and this is version 2 for Azure demo. Okay, so I'm going to change the wording here. And also, as I mentioned, I'm going to break the API call so that we can test it, test the application inside and see how it works. So that's the controller, API controller. So I'm just going to add an exception here. So this is an exception. I want to enforce it to break and see what happens in application inside. So let's commit that. This is version 2. Commit and sync. As you can see, like I'm using Visual Studio Code integration with GitHub. So you can see I'm connected to my GitHub repo here, and I can use the source control add-on here to push directly into my repo without having to install any other third-party tools or use a CLI. Now back to the pipeline, and it already kicked in. So yeah, any other questions?
There was a question here. How can I target a specific slot if I'm balancing the requests between different slots?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll talk about it when we're doing this when we're doing the canary release part. So I'll show you how to target a specific slot when you're doing canary releases.
Beautiful, thank you.
Just write it down.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
There was another great question here as well. This one was from quite early on. We're just waiting for a break or a bit of a pause. Are the containers pre-hardened, or are you using sidecar security injections?
So sorry, say again. What's the question?
Back to the earlier on when you were commenting on the containers element, they said, are the containers pre-hardened or using a sidecar security injection?
So the normal containers, like I didn't do any security specific things for those containers, but what I was mentioning in the ACR slide is that you can use Azure Security Center to scan your images and scan your Docker images and tell you if anything is is not in a good shape, or you've got any threats.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
What is?
Keep the questions coming, guys, as well. I can see that people are pouring them through, so please do keep them coming.
So maybe since we have time, I can show you a little bit about the Azure pipelines and the stage pipelines. So this is the YAML pipeline for Azure DevOps. And as you can see, if you follow this naming convention like Azure-Pipelines YAML without an A, Visual Studio Code is going to understand that it is an Azure pipeline, and it will give you all the intelligence and everything you need when doing that multi-stage pipeline. So yeah, I've got a couple of stages here. So the build, the first one is build, and it runs on an Ubuntu machine. So it just builds an image, pushes the image into the ACR, which is a variable here at the top. And it uses the Docker file that I showed you somewhere here, this one. And yeah, just tags the image with the image name and the build ID. And the next thing is pushing that image into the ACR, and again, tagging it with the same name and swapping the slots. Sorry, the staging one, and then swapping the slots here. Sorry, deploying the slots, deploying image to staging here. The production step, which is swapping the slots, I have disabled it so that I want to show you how it works through the portal. But in case someone needs to use it in the future, and you know, for any project, you have it in the GitHub repo. You can copy it. That's it. Is this the new version? Yep, version 2 is done. So let's now go to that's the production. And before we run the site, what do we expect now? We expect that the staging one, since it was broken and we deployed the new version, when we refresh it, it would have the new version and it would have the new wording that we added in the code. Also, it would have the broken API call. However, for the production, also refresh it, it should have the old existing one because we didn't deploy anything to production yet in version 2. So this is version 2. And as I said, you can go to fetch data and it's broken, but obviously you don't know what's happening, and we'll figure this out in the app inside. Now, let's talk about the Canary releases. So one of the very cool ways of using slots is, as I said, using slots to test a version before it becomes dominant in the production environment. So you can say, I want to redirect 2% of my traffic into the staging slot to test the application and figure out the issues. And you know, before it becomes the dominating one. So let's go to the deployment slots. Come on, Azure. Cool. So you can see here this traffic part. You can say, I want 2% of my traffic going to staging and 98% going to production. So let's demo that. And for the sake of demo, I'm going to do it 50-50 so that we get a chance to see the version 2 when hitting the production URL. So that's the production URL. And again, I'm going to clear the site data and refresh. And you can see it's showing version 2. So let's clear again and refresh. And it's version 1 again. So and that way you can test, you know, your version 2, your staging slot, while getting real traffic coming from production users. And if we click on fetch data here, as I said, it's broken. Now let's go to the application insight and show you a bit about. Oh yeah, sorry. The question that I got about enforcing like a specific slot from that production URL. So that's the production URL, and that's the URL. You can always go something like x dash. Yeah, have it here. Yeah. So that's the keyword. You can append this in the URL. So x-ms-routing name. Using this, you're going to enforce a specific slot if you want to, view that slot in production. So I can say he's staging, and if I have another slot like testing, I can go testing. Yeah. But if I want to see the real production deployment, it's a bit different. You have to go self. Yeah. Okay. Now let's go to App Insights. Yeah. That's the application insight. And as I said, like you get some metrics and stuff. So server requests, server response times, and you can see the last 12 hours, 6 hours, whatever you want. And you've got metrics here, customized metrics if you want, and you've got logs. So for our example, just to remind you what we did, if you go to the controller, the API controller, there is it's called weather forecast controller, and in that action called get, we threw an exception called this is an exception to demo the app insight. Now we go to app insight, and you've got all these custom stuff that you can dig into, but we can go this, and go requests, for instance, and go down here, exceptions, and run. And you can see you've got a couple of exceptions, which is basically because I clicked on the fetch data button twice, so it's recording the exception here. And if you go like details all the way here, you can see that's the message that I got from the code, and you can go, you can see what's happening here in the code and dig there and see that the weather forecast controller is the one that threw that exception, and that's the line number, and that's the method that broke. So yeah, we all know that troubleshooting a Docker container is a nightmare. Yes, it is good and it's very portable, but you have to go into the Docker container to get the logs. But luckily with App Insights, you can just hook up the App Insight with your app service, and the app service is going to report everything into the App Insight. So metrics, errors, logs, everything. Yeah, so just to wrap up the deployment slots. So a staging deployment slot is very helpful, for testers and to finalize the final touches and make sure that the new version is good enough to be swapped into production. Also, you can redirect a portion of the production request to test, as we saw, into your staging version, and use App Insight to monitor the metrics and any potential exceptions happening in the new version before swapping that into the prod. So yeah, some useful resources here. That's the GitHub repo, and some resources for Terraform, Dockerizing an app, deployment slots. I've got 2 links here, and how to set up the React.js app using the .NET template. and some information about the application inside and how to read metrics and logs from your app service. All to you, Philip. Questions?
Fantastic. Thanks, Ahmed. That was awesome. Very, very insightful and very informative. Let me have a quick look. I think we've the team has been busily answering questions directly via the Q&A. Let me see if there are any unanswered ones that may or may not stump. There was one here from Ryan. And Ryan asks, does the SSL cert mapped to a physical load balancer and not impacted during the swapping of IPs between staging and prod?
I don't think, no, it doesn't impact at all, because the whole swap thing is just mapping of the IP virtual address. It's not a physical address, it's a virtual address in application service. So it's not going to affect anything in terms of the infrastructure.
Fantastic. Ryan, if that is clear, just give us a thumbs up on your question. Let me have a quick look and see if there are any other ones. I've answered the question about the deployment slots. Done the container. Yeah, okay, I think we're pretty good. Any other questions? People from, yeah, I can see. Okay, sorry, any other questions through onto the Q&A, people? Just shoot them through. You can answer them live. Here we go. We've got one here. When do you use deployment slots versus use separate environments? What's the best practice there?
Yeah, that's a question that many people ask, because deployment slots, like normally a team would consider having different environments for their application. So they'll have a separate environment for dev, UAT, and staging, prod, but it's not like you have to pick either this or that. You can have an environment a separate environment for dev, UAT, and even staging, but you can also use the staging slot for stuff like canary releases, zero cold start. So the good thing about zero cold start is when you deploy a new application into Azure App Service, it takes some time for the first request, as we saw in the demo. That it takes some time to load up the application and warm it up. With swapping slots and having multiple slots, Azure App Service is going to ensure that the new slot is warm enough before it goes into production. So it goes into production warm enough, like ready to serve the first request, and it's going to be super fast, like no problems. So you can have this and also separate environments. So you can have separate environments for the other, like the environments, dev, UAT, and staging or whatever, and also use the deployment slots for canary releases like testing production, and also warming up the application before pushing to production.
Fantastic, and that actually answers another question from another user here. Just as a segue into that, so how do you manage database versioning when you're balancing between staging and prod? So if a user hits obviously a staging service and their data may essentially be lost. It's a question from Anonymous here.
What's going to be lost? What's the?
So essentially, the question was whether or not if a user was balancing between staging and prod, how are you managing your database versioning?
Oh yeah. So when you're okay, so you're talking about the canary releases, right? Like balancing between. Yeah. Yep. So you can. Yes, I understand your question. So you can have a separate database version for your staging environment, but also when you're doing, if you want to push a new version and do the canary releases, I'm sure like as part of your workflow, you're going to have a newer version of the database. If so, then your new version would talk to this version of the database, while the production slot still talks to the old version. And you need to do some kind of migration, I think. But also, you can have both slots talking to the same database, and you can set that as an application setting in both of the slots.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. There's another good question here as well. How complicated is it to migrate to an app service instead of a new build if a business is to consider this move?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, I really recommend moving to app service if possible. away from virtual machines, and like I've seen a couple of companies using virtual machines just to host an application and taking care of all the infrastructure needs for that application. How easy it is? It's easy as long as your application is in a supported language. So it's a .NET Core, Java, .NET Framework, Python, and there's a list of some languages that are supported. Or, which is a really good thing about containers, if you can containerize that application, it's too easy. Like you don't have to even worry about the application language. As long as it's containerized, you can just push that container into the app service, and app service is going to run the application for you. So yeah.
Fantastic. There are a few more questions coming through. We've got a couple more minutes left, so we'll keep it going. How do we manage app settings in deployment slots when swapping? How is it managed when we when a rollback is required?
Yeah, so maybe I can show you here in the code. So when you're creating slots, when you're creating slots, every slot has got its own app settings. So for example, this is the staging slot. It has got some application settings here. And also that's the main production slot. It's got another set of application settings. So you can have two versions of application settings from here, from staging and production. And when you're moving from staging into production, you can move with the application settings. You can include the application settings. And also, you can leave the application settings as is if you want to reserve stuff like database connection string, for example.
Awesome, fantastic. I think that is the bulk of them. Any other questions? Amanda, Beck, Shri?
No more questions. We don't see any more questions that has come through, but there is one thing I would like to add. We would like to hear from you guys what projects you're working on, if you're doing any DIY on your own time or any other projects at work that you're working on. We'd like to hear about them. So please feel free to share those. Like send out an email or something.
Yeah, if you want, actually, I'm going to send through a survey to everybody afterwards as well, just to, love to get your thoughts and how we can improve. And you know what, feel free to stick it in that little slot there about some of the DIY projects that you're working on that don't involve Bunnings. So stuff that you're staying with at home. I think that probably just about covers it. We're almost at time. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to either contact Ahmed directly. You guys will see his contact details, or myself, Shri, Beck, Amanda. We're all available to answer your questions. Again, thank you so much for your time. I understand everyone's time is precious. I hope you all sort of stay safe. Shri, any other final comments?
No, all good. We'll see you on next Thursday.
Oh, good. Yep. Lovely. Thanks, team. Talk soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.